Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Moses Oketch. Welcome to the second Center for Education and International Development Seminar Series. We call it CEID Seminar Series. We had the first one, I think, a couple of weeks ago on gender and girls' education in Nigeria. This is the second seminar series. So, today we are delighted to have my colleague Tejendra here, who is going to talk to us about his work. The seminar series is an opportunity for us to share our work within the center, but also to invite colleagues who do research globally, who happen to be in London, or the ones we collaborate with, to come and share their work with us. So it's a platform for being enlightened, getting to share the knowledge that we have. I chair the center in relation to the seminar series, but I co-direct the center with my colleague, Professor Elaine Unterholzer. And William helps me with working in terms of the seminar series to facilitate them and to make sure that they happen. Now, the topic today is an important topic. It's on the theme of education in context of violence, and we are going to look at the political economy of education in Afghanistan in relation to violent extremism. And Dr. Tejendra Pherali is going to present to us, and his bio is already in there, but probably it's good for me to just say something about it because it's a good bio. It says Dr. Tejendra Pherali leads the education, conflict and peace building research theme within the Center for Education and International Development. His research focuses on education, conflict and international development in various conflict-affected contexts, including Afghanistan, Nepal, Lebanon, Somaliland, Somalia, and Somalia. Dr. Pherali is the principal investigator for a research project that explores the role of higher education in peace building and social transformation in Somaliland, and is also co-investigator in this GCRF-funded relief, which is Refugees, Education, Learning, Information Technology, and Entrepreneurship for the Future Center, and an ESRC-funded research project that investigates social movement learning in Colombia, Nepal, South Africa, and Turkey. You can see the breadth of his research in terms of the context in which he looks at these issues and the various funding organizations that is involved with in terms of funding his research. I don't want to say more. I think he'll say it all to us, and we are delighted to have you here. So, Tejendra, please.
Thank you, Moses.
Yeah.
Okay, so thanks very much, Moses. I've never been introduced so nicely and extensively before, so I'm really pleased for that very nice introduction. So what I'm trying to do today is to present some of the preliminary findings of our small-scale research, which was actually funded by the British Association for International and Comparative Education. This is a kind of a joint project with my doctoral student Arif Sahar, who is also an Afghan national, and I know that some colleagues here are Afghan here. How many of you? Okay, welcome. So this is just an opportunity for me to share the work and perhaps get some feedback and comments from the audience. So I'm hoping to speak for about 45 minutes.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. And then we'll have plenty of time to discuss and comment and share our views. I work in the area of education, conflict and peace building, as Moses introduced, and we received a small funding to really look at how the emerging Islamic State in Afghanistan was operating and how it was impacting on educational processes in some of the provinces. So we actually framed it as an exploratory study, and we were able to gather about 31 interviews with a number of stakeholders in Afghanistan. And the broad discussion around education, conflict and peace building frames our research, but we are also trying to draw upon discussions and debates that are emerging in the last decade on violent extremism and the role of education in that situation. As we know that civil wars have devastating impact on countries' education system, that it's not just the destruction of infrastructure, but also the displacement of teaching workforce, and also the negative impact on educational spending, because the state funding largely goes into military expenditure in those contexts. But also that conflict causes deaths, and children are one of the largest victims of violent conflict. For example, in Afghanistan, in 2015, so 11,000 civilian deaths were recorded, and 1 in 4 of these have been children. Also, that educational institutions represent state authority, and where there is violent conflict, then the rebel groups tend to attack educational institutions as a propaganda tool, because attacking on educational institutions and children tends to give them the biggest propaganda that they don't have access to otherwise. So schools often fall victim of those extremist activities. Teachers and children are not only caught in the middle of conflict, but also become tactical targets. That it's not just the collateral damage, it's just on purpose, purposefully, rebel groups, in some cases, security forces target schools. And it's not just the access that suffers, but the quality of education suffers immensely in the long term. So in the last couple of decades, particularly after the 9/11 event, there is an increasing debate around violent extremism and how education is being used to radicalize young people who would actually go on to join violent groups. So Atran defines violent extremism as the use of violence in line with an ideological commitment to achieve political, religious, or social goals. This is quite a generic kind of conceptualization of what violent extremism is, that it has this idea of ideological commitment, yeah? And also the use of violence, and who uses violence and who doesn't have an ideological commitment. So you need to be careful in terms of from which position it is being interpreted. But obviously from the international organization's point of view, the groups, the rebel groups that are resisting the state control or the legitimate states in various conflict-affected countries, and they tend to be looked at in terms of how they are using violence and what kind of ideological commitment is being promoted. But there are also the alternative views about who is using violence and for what purpose. So what we see also very recently is the United Nations coming up with this counterterrorism implementation plan, a plan of action to prevent violent extremism, which defines violent extremism as a diverse phenomenon without clear definition. And clearly they refer to the emergence of extremist groups, for example, the Islamic State, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, and others, where we've seen that they tend to capture territory and operate within those territories, and carry out really brutal sort of acts which have been broadcast and recorded and shared sort of live across the world by using the social media. So that kind of changing nature of extremist activities and the use of social media has actually put enormous pressure on international organizations and national governments to rethink about how to deal with these kinds of challenges. And clearly they challenge the sort of world order, the stability, peace, justice and human dignity. And some of the fundamental values have been sort of come under attack because of some of the brutal tactics that have been used by these extremist organizations. But what we've seen is really the changing definitions of these, some of the common concepts, basic concepts that we know. So radical views, if you go back to the history, the Enlightenment movement activists, would have been called as radical, actors who were challenging conservatism and promoting liberal values. And, movement against slavery would have been called kind of radical movement in those times. And in the sort of colonial times in India, when Mahatma Gandhi came up with this idea of civil disobedience and non-violence, that would have been also sort of considered as a quite new and progressive and sort of innovative tool for social change, possibly a radical thinking. But nowadays, I mean, these ideas have been kind of hijacked and are in sort of tension in terms of how we conceptualize. And being radical is problematic, and radicalization is, as a term, sort of used quite extensively in security studies, international relations, and of course, international development debates as well. Resistance is another concept. Is it good to resist? Is it legitimate to resist? And rebellion, political rebellion, for example, fighting against the oppressive structures, injustices in order to establish a more sort of egalitarian sort of state. Is it legitimate? Is it acceptable? So some of these concepts are under scrutiny, even in the academia when we are talking about these issues. There's a quote that I've used here, Anna Dyack, I think that's how it's pronounced, says that extremism is no crime, but there is a tendency to equate protest, rebellion and radicalism as somehow related to problem of violent extremism. So what we've also seen in the last few years is some very sort of heartbreaking attacks on education, on the educational institutions and people. I'm sure we noticed the headlines that over 329 girls were kidnapped by Boko Haram in the Chibok province of Nigeria, in northern Nigeria in 2014. Then we also heard about the Al-Shabaab attack on Garissa campus in Kenya, killing 145 university students. Then in Pakistan, Army Public School was attacked by an extremist group which actually argued that they were taking revenge against the military, who actually were attacking their sort of members in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Then also what we've seen recently is the ISIS activities, where religious minorities, women, children, political activists, journalists, of course, gay and lesbian and bisexual, transgender people being brutally treated, and women being raped, like, for example, the Yazidi women being raped. So we've seen that kind of brutal attack on populations, but also educational institutions have been targeted. So what leads to extremism? There are some conceptual ideas that are sort of out there, and Verghani and colleagues have carried out a systematic review of motivational factors for, or the drivers of extremism. So first is the push factors, they call, that the societal conditions, the structural inequalities, for example, the lack of opportunities or unequal distribution of opportunities across diverse regional or social groups in the country, absence or weak governance of legitimate state, for example, in Afghanistan, protracted conflict, then also the collective sense of persecution on certain groups of populations who feel pushed towards extremism, and also loss of legitimacy, and protracted violence in those circumstances can also push populations towards violent extremism. The second is the pull factors, they call it, the individual motivation or processes which play a key role in transforming ideas and grievances into violent extremism. For example, peer pressures comes as an example. Ideological attraction, that the idea that a new vision, new society would be created through violent sort of rebellion and defeat of the opposition, attract certain groups of people towards violent extremism. But also there are emotional or material benefits that some form of employment can be provided through that kind of involvement. And of course, some are looking for adventures in those circumstances, as we've seen that a large number of young people from European nations or North America went to join the ISIS groups in the Middle East until very recently, and we're beginning to see these people coming back, and tensions in these countries about how to manage those sorts of potential risks. And there are also personal factors, for example, the individual psychological vulnerabilities independent of push or pull factors, for example, mental health conditions. And I think some of the brutal attacks that have taken place in the United States have associations with the personal factors of the individuals who have carried out those attacks. But these kind of factors lead to cognitive and behavioral radicalization. So the cognitive in the sense that people tend to express their support for violent extremism, whereas the behavioral radicalization, that they opt for joining these extremist groups and get into sort of carrying out violent attacks. But there's a lack of solid evidence in terms of what kind of circumstances and what factors are definitively sort of leading to violent extremism. For example, how push, pull, and personal factors interact, and what factors are more influential in leading to violent extremism. So those sorts of questions still sort of unanswered. But there's a lot of sort of qualitative analysis of these issues, and there's a lack of quantitative correlational analysis between these factors and the occurrence of violent extremism. Violent extremism, of course, impacts enormously on peace and security, and it jeopardizes the sustainable development goals. And most importantly, in conflict affected contexts, the provision of humanitarian support is always at risk, because they cannot, those necessary service and goods cannot be provided to the populations that have been affected by conflict. But dealing with these violent extremism, the dominant approach has been really the security-based counterterrorism approach, which we know, looking at the diverse sort of factors that push or pull or also are within the personal circumstances of individuals who are involved in violent extremism, that it doesn't tend to work effectively. So what does it mean for education? So I think always if you look at education, it is sort of seen as a solution to societal problems. But obviously in many contexts, modern education, as we understand, as providing liberal values and of course providing necessary skills for employability and poverty alleviation. So those sort of outcomes is sort of being rejected. That education is failing to mitigate these push factors which lead to violent extremism. For example, educational inequities, that different social, cultural and regional groups not having equitable access to education, which leads to basically social and economic inequalities in the society, can become a serious problem. Cultural repression is another example where a homogenizing national education system which disregards cultural, linguistic and social diversities can be also rejected. It can also marginalize certain ethnic or indigenous communities. Their characteristics, their language, their history may be sort of misrecognized in the process of education. And that can actually lead to socio-political inequalities. So as a result, education can reproduce these push factors. So if you look at the global educational program and the agenda, it tends to kind of rely on this idea of neoclassical sort of thinking, that if we invest in human capital, then it can lead to poverty reduction, and then everybody can benefit from that process, and the issues of conflict can be mitigated as a result. But we're looking at very complex, religiously or culturally diverse societies which have got their own values and systems, who tend to find a sort of modernistic educational logic problematic. So what we've seen really is when education is being rejected, for example, Boko Haram in Nigeria, is the solution is being proposed as protecting the modern education rather than rethinking about how do we make education more relevant for the communities who've got these diverse cultural, religious and social characteristics. I think that is something which is missing, and I think it comes quite explicitly in Afghanistan as well, where education is being rejected by a lot of communities and different social and political groups where that kind of discourse is not being established. So Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies carried out a review of violent extremism and the role of education in mitigating in that, and they proposed these very usual kind of sort of suggestions, if you like. The curriculum needs to provide pluralistic view, and it should promote critical thinking. Teachers and schools and educational institutions need to be inclusive. The decision making needs to be sort of more representative, and young people's and children's voice needs to be incorporated in educational processes. Schools need to be protected, and they should be treated as safe places for children. But also at the same time, access should be sort of equitable to all. So I think these are quite positive and quite promising ideas, but how do you actually do that, and who decides what curriculum is provided, and how children's participation in decision making takes place, how diverse communities come into play while making decisions about education. All of those things are extremely complicated in conflict-affected contexts. And I think that's the reason why we need to look at the distribution of power and resources and history and culture in those contexts. So So we wanted to carry out a political economy analysis of education. In fact, there's another paper which has been already published on the political economy of education in Afghanistan. But this paper is actually focusing on how political economy and violent extremism overlap, and what kind of interactions take place, and what we can learn from that process. So the political economy analysis plays a critical role in agenda setting, particularly in development planning, but also in rethinking reforms in education. So Collinson's definition of political economy, very widely sort of cited, it states that the interaction of political and economic processes in a society, the distribution of power and wealth between different groups and individuals, and the processes that create, sustain, and transform these relationships over time. Political economy analysis can also help us locate education within these broader debates. That the idea is not just to kind of focus education in terms of providing textbooks, increasing funding to add extra classrooms, recruiting teachers, but also going beyond that and then trying to locate education in terms of the sort of broader issues around social, political, and economic policies and dynamics in the country. So in Afghanistan, I think clearly political economy matters because of the way that multiple groups of power holding groups, if you like, state as well as non-state actors dominate educational processes, and there's competition for political and political dominance and control over resources that goes to schools, and there are competing interests and values held by international organizations and the national government, but also the local communities and other sort of religious groups. That after 2001, after the fall of Taliban, so there's a sort of promotion of the agenda of free market and clearly national identity and how different cultural and social groups are represented in the process of sort of promoting a particular kind of national Afghan identity. That is also under tensions. There are geopolitical interests. Clearly, Afghanistan is a sort of a focus of attention for the Western countries. So education is seen as an important sort of vehicle for addressing a broad range of problems that Afghanistan has experienced. So I think it is important to understand what these political and economic factors are, and what are the factors that enable change, and what are the barriers. So that's what we try to do in this paper. As I mentioned at the beginning, it was a small-scale research. This is a work in progress. So what you will see is a lot of data from the field. And we interviewed NGOs, teachers and parents in Kabul and the Nangarhar province, which is the most ISIS-affected province in Afghanistan. And we are carrying out some thematic analysis and some emerging themes that we're capturing from the data. If you look at the history of Afghanistan, education has always been manipulated. When the Russians control Afghanistan, obviously the socialist values were promoted, and education was used for clearly ideological purposes. And also at the same time you had religious groups and mujahideen who were supported to sort of counteract the dominance of Russian influence in Afghanistan. So that's the history that you see until early 1980s. And then what we saw was the emergence of Taliban, and the 9/11 and 2001 etc. But if you look at more recently, the enrollment rate has increased quite dramatically. So almost 900,000 boys attended schools in 2002, and currently 9.1 million students, including more than 2.5 million girls, are enrolled in school. And that is actually sort of presented as a sort of remarkable achievement in the last 2 decades or so, or less than 2 decades, I should say. In the last 15 years, 16,000 schools have been built or reinstated, and nearly 200,000 teachers have been trained, and enrollment rates for school-aged children passed 56%. And 54.5% of the total 30 million Afghans have had no formal or homeschooling. So you have to sort of see that kind of side of the picture as well. And almost 69.3% of Afghan women have no formal education at all. And over 50% of populations is under the age of 15, and around 13% of children in Afghanistan can be classified as child soldiers. 1.5 million school-aged children are still out of school. So these are some of the sort of statistics that show the educational environment of Afghanistan. So when ISIS emerged in Afghanistan, it basically sort of targeted the Afghan-Pakistan bordering areas where the state was quite weak, and the control, the state presence was almost sort of negligible, and those areas were the first sort of attractions for ISIS. As the ISIS has been sort of more and more defeated in the Middle East, and they seem to be sort of moving towards Afghanistan in the ungoverned areas. And some quotes here from the educational stakeholders there. After ISIS announced its presence and establishment in the region, capturing, closing and occupying the school buildings was the first action to create and disseminate a fear among the public and to demonstrate their brutality. And there's another quote from another education officer there where they suggest that most of the schools have been closed or captured by the ISIS, and those that are operating are actually run by ISIS to provide military training or ideological teaching to young children. And they clearly teach hatred towards US and its allies and everyone who supports the Afghan government, and how to commit suicide bombings. So as explicit as that. So in those areas. So there's another quote. So we were active in Achin district before it fell to ISIS, but ISIS closed down all schools in that district, and this caused a significant turbulence to the provision of education. So a lot of educational programs which have been implemented by international organizations, in partnerships with the local NGOs, they have been withdrawn to provincial headquarters because of the threats. As this educational officer from an international organization says, ISIS does not negotiate with anyone. So NGOs and Ministry of Education officials negotiate with Taliban, on the other hand, but ISIS is not willing to negotiate in the provision of education. So why do they target schools? So obviously, as I mentioned at the beginning, schools are easy targets, and schools represent physical and permanent presence of state authority in those areas. And to undermine the state authority, ISIS tend to attack those schools. And schools are also seen as promoting un-Islamic values and Western culture and lifestyle, which these extremist groups see as a problem. And schools can be used as a means to influence the local community, because when children come to school, and then when ISIS organize their activities, they see that as the most effective way of influencing communities. Schools provide legitimacy to the central government, and therefore to undermine the central government's authority, they tend to attack schools. And also attacking schools means causing the maximum harm on local communities who might not support their ideological positions. It is also a sort of fertile space for disseminating radical ideologies. And finally, children are the easiest group to manipulate and mobilize along their sort of campaign. So as a result, a lot of people and some villages have been displaced from the rural areas, and as a result, in the provincial towns, what we saw was overcrowded classrooms and loss of parental involvement. There was some evidence that local communities were participating in providing education, making educational decision making, and there's some evidence that it was quite effective in rural Afghanistan. But after the emergence of ISIS, because a lot of people have been displaced, parental engagement with educational processes has significantly sort of eroded. So as a result, the process of educational decision making sort of has been centralized. But also in some places where communities have managed to stay by negotiating with the Taliban or potentially with other extremist groups, NGOs and provincial educational authorities are increasingly negotiating with these local non-state actors in order to provide education and to disperse educational funding. So this quote from Provincial Education Communication Minister says, NGOs have become more flexible and the practice of decision making has been made more local to respond more quickly to the emergency situation. Some of these quotes actually show, I'm not going to read this, but what they show is that there is some sort of initiative. There are some initiatives to find local ways of making educational processes work. For example, this quote talks about when educational infrastructure building came to a halt because of the threats from the extremist groups, that the funders and also the educational authorities in the provinces tried to negotiate with local people to find ways so that the projects could be completed. So it's not about these are extremist groups, so we're not going to talk, but the local communities are increasingly coming to terms and try and find ways of resolving local issues which are being prevented by some of the violent groups. And this code actually talks about when there is an issue, then different violent groups, the representatives of different violent groups are invited to the district headquarters in order to negotiate and make a decision. And this one talks about how teacher recruitment is actually sort of shared between different groups that operate in those areas, where, for example, here somewhere it says that some like 20 of them were from the Taliban and their affiliates, which means that Taliban would say that out of 40 teachers that are recruited from the provincial government, 20 should be given to us. So they send the number, the name list of teachers, and they are recruited. And of course, this quote says that they are now going for the training, professional development. So these kinds of local sort of ways of managing educational processes seem to be emerging. So the attacks on NGOs are constantly under threat. And as previously said, some of them are sort of finding new ways of making staying in the province and at least trying to support. So increased child labor because of the displacement of children in places where children or families can't stay and can't negotiate with these groups. And clearly there's a significant loss of social capital and support networks among populations. And obviously the psychological impacts on children because their sort of stable life has been sort of disrupted because of when the clashes between the military and the extremist groups. This quote is quite interesting in the sense that it shows an example of how radicalization is happening. Here one school principal talks about how he came under pressure from the Islamic State and he had to be displaced, and his son, who is 17-year-old, was radicalized and began to carry a revolver, and he became a preacher, and he felt very proud of being sort of trusted by the Islamic State. And when his father confronted, and then he actually accused his father of being a spy of the Afghan government or the foreign sort of forces, and he shows his sort of shock basically, and he says, if Islamic State can turn my son against me and my family, they can turn anyone against anyone else. This is dangerous. So these sort of scenarios seem to be appearing. So and there's also evidence of widespread sort of radicalization, like Zaman and Mohammadi talked about Islamist group activities in university campuses, and of course the use of social media is quite prevalent to promote radical views, and educational institutions, including mosques, and also including some of the computer training centers, are being used to sort of promote radical views. So we identify three main sort of challenges. Clearly, security is a challenge, and in that context, weak governance, where the shrinking state presence in rural areas, creating a power vacuum, and then as a result, there is a declining sort of public trust on state institutions because of insecurity. They cannot provide the services that people need. Local authorities survive through negotiations with non-state actors, and obviously there are corrupt practices, because when the funding comes to local institutions, the only way they can sustain is by negotiating and sharing what different groups can get benefit from what is available. So finally, I think insecurity, corruption, and weak governance seem to be the three most sort of prevalent challenges. What really seems to happen is insecurity, fueling sort of loss of accountability, because everything is quite fragile and people are insecure and institutions are always at risk. Then people, institutions and officers, they get away with the lack of accountability. They don't need to sort of show that the educational resources have been spent according to the regulations. Appointments have been carried out based on the fair sort of selection process. Those kinds of rule of law that doesn't exist, because the explanation to that failure is the lack of security, right? So that basically leads to loss of accountability, and that basically leads to corruption, as I said. And then, because there's corruption and loss of accountability, there's public sort of trust on state institution is declining. So the state's legitimacy is seems to be at risk, and which is further fueling sort of weak governance, and then that cycle sort of goes around. And then what we see is fundamentalism and the violent sort of tactics of different armed groups, and the protracted state fragility in Afghanistan leads to a space for radicalization, for violent extremism. So finally, there are international promises of education, but clearly that has to take place within those very complex circumstances, and which basically costs the effective delivery of the educational service, and which is actually fueling public frustration. So I'm sorry that I've painted a very bleak picture of Afghanistan, but hopefully we need to be working together to find some alternative ways of changing these problems. So I will leave it there, and happy to listen to your comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Tejendra. I suggest that we take maybe 3 comments or questions at one go, and then we just keep it rolling as we carry on until about 7 o'clock. So, who has a question? Who wants to start? Just tell us what your name is and your organization, if you wish. That would be great for us.
Thank you, Pherali. Actually, I'm Nur Hussain from Pakistan. The picture of Afghanistan's security situation and the internet education and all the political economy of education is more bleak. I had no idea of this. I was thinking that it's bit improving, and now after this presentation, I will see and understand the situation very well. My question is, I would say, what I was reflecting is do you know really, are there any international fora, or some sort of dialogue which is thinking to push the countries, maybe this is Afghanistan, but maybe there are other countries as well facing this type of situations, because the current and prevalent efforts are really, where I can see here, are not working. Is there any forum that is working to come out of that situation? Thank you.
Any other question? If there is any? Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Farzana. I'm studying education and international development. I'm originally from Afghanistan as well. As you mentioned before about the qualitative research, I'm wondering to know, because I'm from the south, from Farah province, still we have lots of ISIS in Taliban as well. Does the research is just focusing about in Kabul or Nangarhar, or just in our province in Afghanistan? Because in south of Afghanistan, we have lots of exodus out of schools, especially for the girls. I know after 9/11, lots of changes happening in terms of education system. But I'm wondering to know which kind of research. I know it's qualitative research, but in which provinces? Just focusing on Nangarhar and Kabul, or you're going to do more further gathering information? Thank you.
And the last one, if there's a last one. Okay.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. My name is Siddharth. I'm from India. So, before coming to UK, I was working in central India, where there's the problem of left-wing extremism. So, certain parts of central India, where the government has lost its mandate and left-wing extremists are basically controlling the area, the government has decided to move children to residential schools in the buffer zone or a zone which is still in the control of the state, from those areas where the children are actually located. So does Afghanistan do something of a similar nature, where children from ISIS areas are moved to residential schools which are in the buffer zone or in the zone which state has granted?
Okay. Okay, so maybe I'll start with your question. Well, I think Afghanistan is, as a whole, has been very unstable, and its access to resources in order to be able to relocate these children and provide that sort of education elsewhere is probably a very big ask. I haven't come across that kind of program, but when the populations have been displaced from these ISIS-affected areas, the children have been enrolled in sort of provincial capital schools. The places have been sort of provided, and some informal educational initiatives have also been established in order to cope with the influx of number of children coming to education. So I mean, the India's case is different because there are certain areas that have been impacted by the Maoist violence, where the state probably has the capacity to do that, but I'm not sure whether they would have taken all the Adivasi children to educate in a boarding school. That would be very generous of the Indian government. So you probably know better than I do there. And your question about where the research, I think you're right that what we are presenting is based on interviews and the fieldwork that we carried out in Kabul with the central level educational and political and non-governmental organizations, but also in the Nangarhar province, where most of the interviews were conducted. But I do appreciate that other provinces in Afghanistan have different ethnic constructs and different levels of fragility or violence, or lesser amount of influence of ISIS activities. So that wouldn't necessarily be the case. What the picture that we're trying to portray would perhaps indicate the overall scenario of the weak governance and corruption and the problem in educational governance as a whole, but not necessarily it would demonstrate the experiences of violence and some of the quotes that I was showing in other sort of provinces in Afghanistan. So I would be very happy to have further conversation, if you are doing any further research, and of course, so Arif is still conducting his research in Afghanistan, and we are trying to develop this work to have a much more sort of better understanding of the situation. And your question about how can we get out of this situation, and whether the international community is trying to do anything about it. Yes, I think international community is always trying to do something, but obviously there is a problem of how we are approaching educational development in a context which is very divided, has the problematic legacies of violent extremism and religious fanaticism, and very Afghan societies and cultures are very rich and powerful and assertive, and when all of that is ignored and and a particular form of education is constantly sort of pushed in, then there appears to be a problem in implementation. And there are also other types of schools emerging. For example, madrasas, private madrasas for girls seem to be emerging in some of the provinces as well, to kind of reject the mainstream state-supported educational program. But also, I didn't show very much here, but also what's happening if a curriculum is being provided to schools, that curriculum is not necessarily is being implemented as it is being provided. So there's some negotiation. Okay, you can't teach that, you have to get rid of that, you should teach these values, and then only we will let the school run. So that kind of negotiation also seems to be going on. So what can international community do? Probably try to better understand the political economy and try to inform the programming more sensitively, rather than just thinking that more money and more schools is going to solve Afghanistan's problem.
Okay. Right. Let's take another round of questions. We have a bit of time, so another set of 3 questions if possible.
Hi, my name's Adil. I'm a PhD student here. I have 2 related questions. You started off by talking about with a focus on ISIS or IS, and then you sort of included data relating to the Taliban, and I'm wanting to, it feels like there might be more of a differentiation between them than your conclusion suggests, which I'm wanting to unpack a bit. I mean, you yourself spoke about the way that there was a quotation about the Taliban being willing to negotiate, and you showed how education provision, there was an accommodation made by the Taliban, but then you distinguished IS from that. And I read recently about the Taliban seeking to outgovern the national government. So it feels there that the Taliban is taking perhaps a more constructive approach than your data suggests that IS is taking. And my impression is that has historically been quite a strong emphasis on decentralization, seeking to engage with the Taliban in the extent to which they might be able to negotiate. The picture you present of IS is a much starker one, where no negotiation, complete absence of schools, etc. So, yeah, I just wonder, am I picking up an accurate reflection of that distinction?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And if so, do you? It feels to me that there is then, rather than presenting a block conclusion, which suggests, which seems to merge those data, differentiating between them and looking at and helping us to understand those differences in terms of the types of insecurity. I don't know, it feels that there is nuance there, which I'd like to hear a bit more on, perhaps.
Okay, thank you. Yep.
Is there any other question? Okay, then Tejendra, you can answer that one. I think, well, it's a comment, but you might want to engage with it.
Yeah, I think that's a very important comment. And if you look at Taliban, they seem to be more nationalistic in the sense that their agenda is within Afghanistan, and they feel strongly against the international intervention in Afghanistan, but they tend to come closer when negotiating public services that are provided to local communities, and they tend to collaborate with local communities more often and benefit from some of the development programs that are available. So I think the quote there is about how they are sending representatives in negotiating teacher recruitment and how many teachers should be actually recruited from their own sort of groups. And there's obviously this economic dimension attached to it, and how the money that goes to these groups is going to be utilized for their own groups. But the ISIS seems to be more sort of Islamic Caliphate kind of very strong kind of agenda, non-negotiating and more brutal than Taliban, because Taliban draw support from the communities in order to sustain and survive and sort of expand their agenda for the vision for Afghanistan, really, and they have a clear political goal to come into power and govern Afghanistan, whereas ISIS seem to have a much more sort of radical, sort of Islamist kind of a caliphate kind of approach, where they would sort of eliminate anyone who would stand against them. And also there is a dimension that the ISIS fighters tend to be more coming from outside Afghanistan, so it is sort of their sort of goal rather than community interest seems to be quite dominant. But I take your point in terms of whether presenting two different narratives based on the types of extremist groups would have been much clearer. But also it's not just Taliban and ISIS. There are other types of, extremist groups operating there as well. So I think that's something that I think is a very useful comment. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other comments? Yes, one is there.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm studying the Gender Education and Social Development course here. I'm struggling to understand how, if the NGOs and schools are negotiating with the Taliban, and then there is something compromised in the curriculum, and the kids will become more radicalized, I'm struggling to understand how, in the long term, there is a gain from being within these systems and being educated. And it's because I just think maybe the kids' idiosyncrasies will start changing as well, and then that would have a knock-on effect on society, and all these externalities that then come from that will just maybe exacerbate the situation rather than improve and help these children create more opportunities for themselves.
I think you have an answer in your own question, if it is a question really, because this is problematic, and what it is leading to is really unknown. Is it better than children not learning at all, or if local negotiations can create a space where children can learn something, whether it is better, even if it is a particular type of learning which might be sort of counterproductive to the idea of Afghanistan which the Afghan national government wants to promote or the international community wants to see, right? So, but that's what seems to be happening at local levels, because the government doesn't have the control over these schools and the areas. So that seems to be the scenario. But where that would lead to, it's all of us to kind of ponder on, isn't it? Yeah.
Let's carry on. Yes, please.
It was an answer to the question. It's something. It is not something negative, maybe to include extremists in the system, even in education, because children of Taliban will go together with children of normal Afghan, as we can consider that, and so it can be compromised, but in the long term it can be the good choice even. So I mean, we still don't know who will be the one, but it's a good try.
Yeah. But also there's no maybe this clear distinction between Taliban and normal Afghan is this Western construct. It's a problematic thing. Afghan, Taliban, and it's not possible really to kind of categorize. And one of the quotes that we've got here is that where the participant describes that there was a fighting at a school overnight, and the following morning there were dead bodies of the school, of the teachers of that school lying on the ground. So, and what people heard was about the fight between the security forces and Taliban, and then they saw two of their teachers dead. That basically confuses in who is Taliban and who is not. William?
I've got a question about some of the other actors and stakeholders in the broader sphere of the political economy of education in the Afghanistan context, and in particular with regards to international actors there, and how education or education processes are involved with the establishment of the legitimacy of international actors, or whether it's a form of like soft power, whether it's instrumentalized by others other than just some of the domestic and local actors in the Afghanistan education context.
Okay. Do you want to go for it, sir?
I think my comment or rhetorical question kind of is the broader context for what you just proffered, and that is that the term political is in the title of the research and the endeavor, but there seems to be a slightly sanitized conceptualization of the term, because if we're talking about larger context and international players, and you mentioned the interests of donors and geopolitical influences, yet there's no reference made to what's become common knowledge, which is that America funded ISIS to begin with to destabilize certain governments in the Middle East. So I'm wondering if this kind of narrowing down or sort of tunneling of vision about education and how there's a political economy involved around the development of education in these insecure systems, how is there, or what thoughts do you have on making a connection between that smaller context and the larger pieces of knowledge that, as I say, are quite common now?
Okay. Yeah, so obviously a crucial question, but very difficult to answer. I think, I'll just try to respond to both comments or questions collectively. What the international community is trying to do is to establish the legitimacy of the Afghan government. And the Afghan government is supposedly the representative of the Afghan people, and therefore the programs that the national government gives out should be the people-oriented programs benefiting for the people. But the picture I was trying to portray is more sort of local and national political economy, rather than being more explicit in terms of how different actors, like international actors, have actually promoted and supported different conflicting parties. Yes, it goes back to supporting Mujahideen in 1970s by the Western allies against Russia, and that fundamentalization took place over several decades, and which now actually backfires. And Taliban are arguing for reinstating the Mujahideen era curriculum in education in Afghanistan, which is actually problematic for the international agencies, I guess. At that time, for the US, the University of Nebraska designed all that curriculum and said that, yes, this is a great curriculum for Afghanistan because, it can liberate Afghanistan from the Russian dominance. But now, no, it's not good for you because that could be problematic for us now, right? So, yes, that kind of bigger geopolitical issue, exists out there. But I haven't thought about going that far in understanding the geopolitics. But we try to understand more sort of micro-level educational processes and the issues of governance in trying to make sense of what is happening now. But that doesn't mean to say that the question you are asking is not relevant. Of course it is relevant. Maybe we should think about doing that in the next phase. Right.
Other comments?
Sorry, can I have another one?
Yeah.
Just again, looking at conclusions, you emphasised earlier in your presentation the point about the impact of violence on education quality, and some of the other questions we've had refer to the outcomes of education in terms of quality. It would be interesting to have that sort of perhaps broader range of measures of quality of education within your conclusions, or to see, so how, because again, you presented with a very nice vignette of, or I mean a tragic vignette of what happened to that school principal's son as one marker of the quality of education that is produced.
Mm.
But then again, in some of those, in schools where those 20 Taliban teachers were teaching, maybe it was much more akin to what was happening in government schools. So to have an understanding of what type of education quality is emerging from the different types of education that are being produced by this political economy, I'd be really interested in at a future point what those might be, or indeed now.
Yeah.
Insights.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important question as well. But obviously, carrying out research in Afghanistan is hugely problematic from security reason. And secondly, what counts as quality? That's a big question, isn't it? Is it about literacy and numeracy? Or is it about how education is leading to sort of positive well-being for children, and, you know, promoting coexistence, social cohesion and peace and development, that kind of thing. I think those are very important debates, but at the moment they appear to be too far in those places where we are focusing our research.
But I mean, it feels like the vignette about that 17-year-old boy with a revolver is a really powerful indicator. I mean, that there's lots of quality of education going on there, which is really important.
Yeah.
So you don't need, you wouldn't necessarily, conversations would give an indication. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the point. You know, they might be very much empowered, not in the way that we would like to see, but that seems to be happening, right? And I think in many other places, in conflict-affected contexts, the young people might not have gone through formal education, but they go through, you know, so immense sort of engagement and activism and participation in so many things, which can be an indicator of some form of learning, maybe bad learning, dangerous learning, but that seems to be happening. But I'm not interested in promoting that kind of quality. Of course, we need to be thinking about quality education which promotes peace, social justice, and development. And it's just that there's the security issue and the lack of good governance is preventing you know, any kind of meaningful education to take place, and also constant displacement of children from stable learning environments. So yeah, so maybe that's something we need to rethink. I mean, what quality means in those contexts. I mean, that's a common problem in global sort of discourse about access to education in difficult circumstances. And you know, just after the introduction of the SDG goals, the quality has been really sort of emphasized as an important sort of goal. Otherwise, in the last 10-20 years, the debates have concentrated on access, right? Yeah. Okay.
Great. We have time. We have about 10, 11 minutes. If you still have a burning question, please say it.
Yes, I don't know whether I will be able to formulate this question properly, but like with respect to early grade literacy and numeracy, I feel that the curriculum for early grade literacy and numeracy is a little bit more ideologically agnostic, as in there's no ideology coming up there. That's my hunch. So with respect to that, how are like international organizations or like the Taliban government or the local community since there is no ideological leanings in early grade literacy and numeracy, are the players in the education space able to push it to Taliban or other non-state actors that this at least needs to be taken care of properly, and you shouldn't have a problem with this?
Well, I mean, I don't think literacy and numeracy is proof from any ideological positions, because literacy is always about something, right? So that something is chosen for certain purposes. So in one of the papers that we've done, we actually write about this so the way that literary texts were presented. So the literary texts would start with A is for Allah. Allah protects all Muslims. J is for jihad. Jihad is an obligation of all Muslims. T is for tupak, which is gun. Ahmed has a tupak and conducts jihad with it against the Soviets. So this is from textbook grade 1. So the Mujahideen used subjects as apolitical as mathematics as a means of glorifying jihad. So there is that evidence as well. So even in mathematics, it's very fair. I don't know if you have seen any of that, but there's a mathematics question which pretty much says that the speed of the bullet is such and such. If a Mujahideen targets a Russian soldier, how long would it take to kill the soldier? That kind of, you can see, ideology quite powerfully ingrained in, even in subjects like mathematics. Okay.
You're all satisfied? Then any other questions that you have? Very good. My question is, I wondered whether insecurity comes first or loss of accountability, corruption leads to insecurity, but that's maybe for another day. Just the sequence of the logic of how they fall in.
They're in the circle.
They're in the circle.
Yeah,
right, that's fine.
Yeah.
But otherwise, a round of applause. Thank you for...
Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's an important, difficult topic to research, and thank you, Tejendra, for sharing with us your work. As I say, CEID is here as a seminar platform for sharing this kind of intellectual work and to interrogate issues that affect humanity and to make the world a better place. If you're not signed up, William is here. He works with me, makes these things to happen. Please sign up. We have a scheduled series in terms of seminars, but we also normally have ad hoc visitors who come by and want to share their work with us. So thank you for coming and stay in touch. You can continue to interact if you need to.